Stories from Foster Care is brought to you by the Irish Foster Care Association in association with the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth.
Hi, I'm Niamh Barrett, and on today's episode of Stories from Foster Care, I'm talking to Fiona Neary. Fiona is the author of the book Parcels in the Post, Growing Up with 50 Siblings, which is about her life as a birth child of foster carers. Fiona went on to work in social care herself, co-founding the Rape Crisis Centre in Castlebar in 1993, and later acting as National Coordinator and Executive Director of Rape Crisis Network Ireland.
I was young enough and all the rest of it. I leapt into the rape crisis world because for me it meant independence, it meant potential for an independent voice and to be able to start making noise in some ways about all the things that Ireland did not know how to talk about and that Ireland was minimising, and that, you know, it gave me a way now to, okay, you want change, what does that mean? How do you do that? What does it look like?
She is currently co-director of the Lennon Hall Arts Centre in Castlebar. I caught up with Fiona over Zoom from her home in the west of Ireland. So Fiona, thanks very much for coming onto the podcast today.
I'm delighted, very delighted.
It's great to have you. You're the author of the book Parcels in the Post, Growing Up with 50 Siblings.
That's right.
Which, as far as I'm aware, is the first book or memoir about being a child who fostered or a birth child, as we also describe it.
Yeah.
What prompted you to write the book?
Well, there was a couple of things. I joined a creative writing group. There was a few things going on in my life that weren't too wonderful. And I joined a creative writing group just as a way of reconnecting and connecting with my own creativity a little bit as well. And you would get writing prompts and I would write about everything and anything. But what I noticed was if ever I wrote anything about fostering, the group would be very interested. You know, you came back in every week and you read your homework and you got feedback. And I noticed two things. First of all, there was a curiosity about, if I wrote about fostering, there was a curiosity in the group. But the other thing was, the questions they would ask, I would be like, oh my God, I haven't a clue. I really haven't a notion. You know, because you take the way you grew up as just, you know, that's the way it is. So between those two things, I'm quite lazy. So I would just use their questions as prompts for my next piece of writing and my next piece of writing. And then because of my previous working life, I did have something of a discipline around sitting down to a blank page and you've got to write and you've got to make it make sense to someone else. So I just started settling into it more and more. And then I got more curious about my own writing. And then I started to get more curious about what was it, if I had something to say about growing up in a family that fostered, what would it be I would have to say about that? So I didn't set out to write a book. If I was going to write a book, I don't know that I would ever have thought to write a book about growing up in a family that fostered it. So it did come about for a while quite organically.
Yeah. So following the trail, as it were, of other people's curiosity, realizing they don't understand anything about this really.
Yeah, and then also the little ego boost that goes with that. Oh, I know something other people don't know. All the little ego boosts that go with that. And then I began to get more and more curious about it myself. And I was invited to do a reading of a piece at a lovely event called Over the Edge in Galway. And after that, the woman who organised it, Susan Miller-Dumar, said to me very clearly, you know this is a book. And that's when the idea was like, maybe, but it feels like I started in the middle. So how do I whip that into shape?
Was it hard to remember all of it, or did it come back to you fairly easily as you kind of looked into it again? Because it covers a long period of time.
Yeah. And well, the first thing is when I started chatting to my family about it, you realise we've all remembered things completely differently. Like obviously we all experienced being in a family that fostered. We all experienced all the same kids, more or less. But our different memories were priceless. And there was one running joke where none of us could remember where I slept when I would come home from college. So literally none of us can remember. So you also realize you're in a territory where there's going to be different memories of things. And my mother had passed away, and my mother was the one who held the center of fostering. So a lot of the details of information passed away with my mother. So I didn't have that first account of things when I started digging into it a bit more. And anyone who has fostered in a family that did things like emergency placements, you know what it's like. There's so much coming and going. There's so many social workers. There's so many kids. There's so many birth parents. So you've got to somehow find a way to retain the true complexity of that story whilst having the reader feel that it's no effort to read that, because otherwise they'll switch off. So, as it more and more became a book, and as I realized more and more what it was I wanted to say, you're kind of walking all those different balancing wires.
Yeah, and you do. It's a really strong book, and the voice, your teenage voice, is so clear and strong and honest, I would say as well. How did your fostering life begin, though? It was with your mother, wasn't it?
Very much so. So we were a very typical West of Ireland family in that my parents emigrated to London in the late 60s. So we were immigrants in London, and we came back in the late 70s. So very typical West of Ireland story. So when we came back from London, we were given some land on the family land. My dad built a house, and he had got a job at the council and was also helping out with the family farm. And my mum was working in shops and chip shops and all the rest of it. And what I found out afterwards was, again, we all had different notions of why mum started fostering. So some of us thought it was because there was only one boy in the family and we needed more boys. And, we just had notions. And then Dad told me then eventually when I was digging into the book that at my Holy Communion in England, and when we were going to Mass, my mother had spotted a woman in the church who would be coming with different kids to church and got to meet her. They bumped into each other at my Holy Communion, although knowing my mother probably made a beeline for her. And so that was the first time she met someone who fostered, and she was curious about it. So when we came back to Ireland, none of us know exactly how she made connection with community nurse. So back in the early 80s, it wasn't even social workers, there was a community nurse. And she connected with the community nurse. So I think it was a combination of it when she was working outside the house, she was working evenings or nights. So she was at home during the day, she had time on her hands, it would bring in some bit of extra money, which was always welcome. And I think my mother was curious about the world. So I think it was all of those things, really.
And that decision that she made ended up bringing like a whole cast of characters, if you like, into your house, not just the children who you were fostering, but social workers, other professionals.
Yeah.
And you said you were sort of holding all of this complexity at a young age. How was that?
Well, we started off, we got a very easy start to it. So when I think about it now, we started fostering in the early 80s, and I think of it that somewhere along the way, we were almost taking over from the mother and baby homes, because our first experiences of fostering were very kind of cute and sweet because it was a lot of babies. So back then, if a woman or girl was pregnant outside of marriage, she gave birth in the hospital, she was encouraged to give the child up for adoption. And she had 6 weeks then to make up her mind. And while she was making her decision, the babies came to us or another family like us. And her pregnancy may or may not have been hidden. If she was quite young, she may have gone off to mind an aunt, or, it may have been still quite hidden, the pregnancy. We didn't know. And sure, we weren't thinking about any of this until much later. I was about 11 or 12. So at first it was just all babies coming into the house, and they all stayed for about 6 weeks. And then we were given a fairly romantic version of it. You tell children what they're able to hear. And I was 11, but my sister was only 9 and my brother was only 7. So we were told what we were able to hear, which was that the mammy, for whatever reason, can't mind her baby, and the baby's now gone on to their forever home. We're the in-between home, and they're going to have the best life and be very happy. So that's how it started off. And there wasn't a huge amount of contact with social workers. They were kind of only there to drop the baby off and collect the baby. And I start off the book, literally the first day the teenager comes home, there's a new baby in the house, and there's all this stuff the social worker has dropped off. And it was a liberating choice for me as a writer to choose the voice of the teenager. Because it wasn't me, the adult, looking back going, and then one day this happened. It's the teenager in the absolute immediacy of what's happening in her life with these children coming and going. And I think that works well.
Yeah, it has a freshness and a rawness and a kind of an unfiltered honesty to it. That's very refreshing and very, very vivid, really, as well. It really brings it alive. So you make reference to kind of inhabiting a world where there was a lot of secrecy, where not necessarily your family, but in the wider society, a blind eye, you could say, was being turned to the types of issues that were bringing children into care. It's quite striking how you're carrying that in a way.
Yeah, it was a funny one. I mean, we were already different to our immediate neighbours because we were, the family that had come home from England. Not that was uncommon, but there wasn't anyone immediately around us who had that experience. And of course, we'd had years of experience of the English education system and of how things were different in England. So then you're in the Irish system. And as the babies we were then fostering toddlers and older children. So as the children got older, there was a broader range of reasons why the children were coming into care. And also we were absorbing more information about them. And we knew from the social workers, things like you weren't allowed to take photographs of foster babies, even at the communions or christening. There was a lot of christening. And you weren't allowed to take photographs. So there was this kind of discretion around them. And on the one hand, you knew this discretion was about their privacy and their right to privacy, and it felt appropriate. But as you were beginning to know more about why children were coming into care, it began to feel more and more uncomfortable. It began to feel less like you were protecting people's confidentiality and more like you were colluding in so many secrets. And realising that in every town and village and community in Ireland, there were these things that absolutely nobody ever talked about, ever. Just this blanket of shame, secrecy, so mental illness. You'd have references to the queer one, and in some ways there could be a kindness or a gentleness around people who were odd or whatever, but there wasn't a real addressing people who had quite severe mental illnesses, or I don't even know if there were the words for postpartum depression then, women who went into quite severe depression, having had children or having had more children, alcoholism, domestic violence, sexual abuse, severe neglect. These things were not talked about anywhere in Ireland. And I remember the very first time I saw on television someone who was described as a single parent, and it was on English television. So it was a single parent. It wasn't an unmarried mother. The people whose children were going through our house day in, day out, they were not represented anywhere on television, in the media. They were not talked about. They were very, very invisible.
And there's a sense of you as that teenager sort of scanning the TV programs and looking for reference points.
Yeah. Because
for your life.
Yeah, because what's happening to you that's not happening to anyone else is you're beginning to learn about court orders and social workers monitoring family situations. So I just have this little bit about, so there's Fame was the big television program, and there's a kid in Fame, Leroy, and we kind of know his parents weren't good. And we know that some of the kids that are in our house now, they've arrived with the Gardaí and with care orders, and we know there's an investigation. So you're kind of trying to find a reference for that or something like that anywhere else in the world, and it just didn't exist. There was just no mention of it. It just magically didn't exist anywhere, and yet somehow there were more and more children coming into our house.
How did that affect you with your friends and your peers? Was it kind of something of an obstacle in getting to know people or being spontaneous with people, or did it feel like a burden to carry that?
I don't think so. I mean, I was out for a pint with a friend recently, and he reminded me that he was saying, do you remember we used to get grinds in biology? And do you remember that time the parents arrived at the house? And I had no memory of this whatsoever, but it was a time he was in our house and birth parents turned up and they weren't supposed to be there. And of course, you can't ring social workers because it's after hours. So what do you do? And he had remembered this. So I suppose in your own way, you were trying to walk that line of being protective of the kids who were in the house. You didn't necessarily want everyone to know their business. It wasn't fair on them for people to know their business. You were walking up the road to school with them and you felt very protective of them, apart from when you wanted to kill them for messing with your stuff and getting in your way. But you did feel naturally very protective of them. So you didn't necessarily want their business to be anyone else's business. But at the same time, I was turning into this massive boiling pot of rage about all the things that were not being spoken about.
And at some point, your family took in a couple of children from a married couple, which was a bit of a departure, it seems like, at the time. And those two children are so much at the heart of the book.
Yeah.
Two girls in particular. You've called them Mairead and Bernadette, obviously not their real names, but your description of the ways that they presented so differently in response to the trauma they'd experienced, and then how you began to respond to that, it's just a beautiful description of a relationships rather. Can you say a little bit about how they came into your life?
Yeah, I mean, they arrived in like a tornado and a flood in a way, because Bernadette her coping with the trauma was to express it. It was out, and she was ferocious, and she was hyper vigilant. You know, we know all the words now. We didn't know any of the words then. And her younger sibling had turned inwards. You know, the terror she had been through had turned her inwards, in on herself very much so. So she was almost impossible to connect with. She'd lost all faith and all trust in the world. So she was almost unreachable. So, yeah, I mean, they were unforgettable in that. You know, they really landed. But this is the thing, and I suppose I assume this of everyone in a way, that, you know, if you spend time almost with anyone in a caring setting, you know, they were in our house and they needed care, and you can't not love them, even when you really want to kill them. They're driving you around the bend, and both of them drove me around the bend in different ways. The child, Bernadette, who was very active and hypervigilant, was constantly pulling at my stuff. Records were my thing, and she would be pulling at my record, so that you feel invaded, and that child has no boundaries. And the other child was very difficult to love or feel anything for, because she expressed nothing. I mean, you realise later she was in the depths of grief, but she was unavailable to receive any kind of loving. So, you know, this miserable wet rag of a child is around you, and you don't know what to make of her. But then you have, when you live with people day in, day out, you have little moments with them where that starts to shift and the little connection is made, and you see something, you know. And they're just so fragile and so small. And there were parts in the book where I did want to describe, you know, when you're a teenager in Ireland, parents didn't hug very much. There is not much physical contact with others, maybe if you're in sport. But I also wanted to describe that for me as a teenager, it was very wonderful for me. One of the things that was wonderful for me about fostering was the physicalness of it, holding babies, hugging babies, holding these kids they're in the bed with, you're back in, it brought a physicalness back into my life that as a teenager I missed. I didn't know it at the time, but writing about it in hindsight, physically hugging, it was lovely to have that around the children.
There is a real sense of the child hands-on fostering at this point where, and you don't say much about it actually in the book, but you make reference to sort of knowing at what point to go into Bernadette when her night terrors were beginning, when she wasn't too far into them, that she could sort of maybe comfort her a little bit out of it at the start, kind of getting that sense of timing, it felt like, or knowing to take her in for a shower or taking them swimming. There's all these ways that you were very much fostering, very hands-on.
I mean, you don't remotely I didn't remotely think about it. And I suppose I feel every birth child experience of fostering is very different. So, I was 12 going into 13 when we started fostering. So I was of an age, I was much older than the kids we fostered for a long time. There's an element, combination of care and also ferocious practicality. We were living in a medium-sized house, I suppose. And in order to make that work, you've got to look after people around you as well. If you want to sleep yourself, you've got to figure out how to stop someone else having a nightmare. It can be that brutally practical as well as being caring. But yeah, it's a child who experiences night terrors. And so we have to, as a family, we have to be taught what's the difference between a nightmare and a night terror. And it is a case of who can get to the child in the bedroom the first. And sometimes your bedroom at times might be the nearest. So, and you just want to get back to sleep. You're totally on the one hand, you're being it's the selfishness of proximity. You do whatever means that you'll get back to sleep,
Yeah.
And
sure.
Yeah, it really, so, oh God, if I do this, then she'll shove up.
Yeah, and I can go back to sleep again.
Yeah.
Lovely. The birth parents of those children are a big presence in the book as well. And it was really kind of both striking and touching for me how your view of them changed a little bit over time, not massively, but you were open to receiving new information about them, let's say. Can you say a little bit about how you encountered them, both actually when they came to the door and you didn't expect that, but sort of within your own mind as well?
I was a very sanctimonious and smug teenager who wanted everything to be black and white. You want heroes and villains, and you want to be on the side of the heroes, and you want to beat the baddies. And I wanted it all to be that simple, and I wanted to be a smug, sanctimonious, holy angel, So... yeah, I wanted the birth parents in situations where we knew there had been abuse and neglect. I just wanted the parents to be baddies. I wanted it all black and white. And then during the course of the book, a situation arises where the narrator has a bit of a shock and begins to realise that being that black and white is not quite, it doesn't fit. It's part of the teenager maturing, is her beginning to realise it's not that simple. And the teenager desperately does not want to feel any empathy at all for the abuser. And yet the situation that they're in, she really has this shock when she realises that it's quite clear that her life has been a lot more privileged than this abuser's life, even though the narrator's from a very working class rural background. It wouldn't be by any means a wealthy background, but she can suddenly see black and whiteness is not going to work. And it's a deeply uncomfortable moment for the teenager, because your lovely little black and white setup doesn't fit anymore. It's very uncomfortable. So that's in that one situation, and that family were in our lives for a very long time. So there's a big arc of a story there, I'm trying to think, with other parents. Yeah, there were other parents who came with other children, and we wouldn't be around them very much. There was a kind of a natural awkwardness. They would be a bit awkward as well, coming into our house for the first time. It's our territory. We're familiar with everything. They're not. we're handling their kid. You know, there is an awkwardness around that, but there wasn't that need for it to be so, you know, those might not be situations where the child was actually abused or neglected. It might just be a family situation where this support was necessary at that time, and you were actually quite happy to see that child go back home. Whereas in the situation of meeting an abuser and being in contact with an abuser, that was very different, because you were terrified that the children would ever go back to him. And yet the monster cannot be reduced to just being a monster, because you've seen some things and you realize, oh my God, there's much more to this picture than I wanted to know.
Yes, it's an amazing moment in the book. It really is. You said that, paraphrasing obviously, it was the impact of the system and the failures of the system were greater than the children, or the suffering of the children, in a sense. Was that what made you just so furious? Because that's really clear in the book, how angry and upset you are at the decisions that are made.
It might be a little bit oversimplified. It's not that fostering doesn't have any impact on birth children. It does have an impact, but I think there's lots of things that birth children can take on board and can understand. But I think what I found brutal was the court cases. It was, the way I try and articulate it now is, I feel that when children come into care, they deserve the very, very best of us as a community. They're so vulnerable, the displacement that goes with this, the upheaval in their lives. They really deserve the best of us as a community. And that is not what they got in the 80s and 90s. And unfortunately, it's not what they get now. Now, the reasons are different now. The circumstances are different. In the 80s and 90s, a lot of it was to do with court cases where children were not listened to. But what really got under my skin and unsettled me as a teenager was realizing these children are not getting what they need. Okay, they're coming into care. Most of the time that seems to be necessary, but it isn't enough. It's not good enough, you know, and realizing how badly these children could be let down once they were in care. I think that upset me and impacted me a lot more than the fact that sometimes children have to come into care.
Yeah, and judges in particular drew your ire.
Yeah, it was the 80s, and now I can't say that every word of what in the book about what happened in court cases is accurate. It's how we were told or how we remember it. But there were situations where children were sent back to abusers. There were situations where judges made decisions and we wanted to go in and punch their heads in. Because, you know, I had lived with that little boy or that little girl. I knew how small their arms were. I knew how small they were. And I knew how big that man was that they were going back home to. And I knew what that man had done. I had seen it on these children's bodies. I had seen it in the way they were in the world. And at the time, family rights, parents' rights, fathers' rights in particular, overruled everything else. There was so little understanding of the dynamics of abuse in a family. There was so little understanding of the reality of abuse, and in some ways not excusing the failures of the Catholic Church, but when it all began, come more into focus. In some ways it was easier to look at the abuse in the Catholic Church as an institution than to look very, very closely at families, where the majority of sexual violence was happening in families and the extended family, and that's where the majority of neglect was happening, for whatever reason. So we did see judges make absolutely horrendous decisions and children being sent back to families where we knew they weren't safe. And just the rage that came with that. Now I had someone very nice and black and white to be raging with again.
Yeah, that rage, that sense of the injustice, what happened to that over the years for you? How did that lead you, if it did, into different areas of life as you grew older?
Well, of course, I didn't know I was angry. I thought this was all, this is all just life. You're getting on with it. And also, that part of my life in England, part of what I also found in Ireland was there tended to be a thing in Ireland if there was one way to do things. this is the way it's done. Whereas I had lived somewhere else, and to me that was rubbish. But I just became very determined to want to get a lot of these stories out into the open. And I wanted people to have some sense of what it is, anyone who has been in care, what it is they walk with in their life, as you people really have no idea. You know, what it is for some of those kids, what it takes for them to get up and get through the day. You know, I used to say it was what they're carrying. We used to go up the road to school together. And even if we were going to different schools, and the image I would use is, you know, what I was carrying in my school bag was so different to what they were carrying in their school bag. And never forget it if someone has been in care, you know. So I had this enormous drive, which I didn't recognize for what it was, to start getting things out in public. You know, can we all just be more honest about what's really going on here? And I'd say I was a total pain in the arse to be around. You know, I was quite self-righteous and demanding and, you know, pushy. I think I was quite pushy around it. You know, I was desperate for this change to happen. And it was very difficult to find any other quarters where there was receptivity for that. You know, there was so much minimizing. Sure, things would be grand. Sure, it's not that bad. You know, and I found that intolerable. I found it unbearable. I had to have this stuff come out.
Hello, I'm Sadie Harper, and you're listening to Stories from Foster Care podcast. Be sure to subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
We were talking about that sense of anger, and you were saying that, yeah, you might have been a pain in the arse or demanding and so on, but sometimes that kind of energy is necessary.
Yeah, and also there was a situation that arose where I was working in residential care, and some of the children in the house that I was now working in as a residential childcare worker had lived with my family. So I went from being a foster sibling, I was no longer their foster sibling, I was now a member of staff. And I've tried to write about this and I haven't managed to do it successfully. But residential care, I mean, oh my God, I don't know. It did nothing to quell my anger, that's for sure. And the staff were great. The other staff that were hired were great. Obviously, I was still a bit smug and sanctimonious because I had grown up with children in care. They hadn't. I was still a bit smug around social workers because, especially with the younger social workers, I knew a lot more than them. I'd grown up with this. And of course, you experience the limits of social workers. You know, which isn't the limit of social workers. It's the limits of the system when you're in it. And at the time when we were fostering, children exited care at 16, and for a very long time there was no aftercare. So there was plenty for me to be really angry about. And of course, that's the reality social workers have to deal with. And one of the big shocks for me, and it was such a big shock for me, was that social workers are not advocates. You know, so what was happening in me a lot of the time was, where is the person who is advocating for these children in care? Where is the independent advocate voice? Again, I didn't know that's what I wanted, but I knew that was the gap. So social workers, and there are many, many very good social workers, they work on behalf of the state to implement our care system. That's not the same thing as being advocates for children in care. So I knew that without being able to put words on it. So I was now working in residential care. I was getting paid vastly more money than my mother ever got paid to often mind less children. I got holidays a week. I used to go down to Mum and take the mickey out of her because she was still fostering. And I had XYZ on my paycheck and she had sweet Beckall on hers. So, you know, just these two parallel systems. And of course, the irony of it was the kids who were now in residential care had lived with my family. So I had this very stark comparison between residential care and foster care. So I'm going to try and write about this again, but I've written about it, but I haven't written about it well. It turns into spaghetti. But anyway, the point being, I was eventually being offered a permanent pensionable job as a residential childcare worker. And I just knew it would drive me demented, that it was doing nothing for all this rage and agitation that I had. This was not going to be, being an employee of the state was not going to get me what I wanted, which was change, to be somehow involved in change. So I was very lucky. I met another woman who was interested in setting up a rape crisis centre. I was literally going around saying, we need to people, anyone know anyone who wants to set up a rape crisis centre? We need one. And I was very lucky, and I was connected up with a local woman who was very interested, and we started filling out grant applications, and we got a very small grant to do something towards setting up a rape crisis centre. And I used that as my way to jump ship. So I left statutory employment, and I was young enough and all the rest of it. I leapt into the rape crisis world because for me, it meant independence, it meant potential for an independent voice, and to be able to start making noise in some ways about all the things that Ireland did not know how to talk about, and that Ireland was minimising, and that, it gave me a way now to try and, okay, you want change. What does that mean? How do you do that? What does it look like?
Just looking at the system as it is now.
Yeah.
Do you feel that the state is missing an opportunity in terms of recruiting foster carers by not looking at children who are fostered as adults?
Potentially. But there's two ways of looking at it. You see, it's so different. I don't know that I'm very well placed to talk about what fostering is like now, because, I've been out of it a very long time as such. So some things are very different. So, for example, when we were fostering, none of those children got any psychological support, not the ones who were sexually abused, not the ones who came in on an emergency placement for 2 weeks and was still there 2 years later and nobody knew where they were going. Children who really needed psychological support. It wasn't available then, whereas I understand that's different now to some extent. The luxury we had then, of course, we didn't know it was a luxury, was that we had the same social workers for years. For years and years and years, we had the same social workers. And I understand that in a free fall now in terms of the recruitment crisis and so on. So some things are very different now. I think, and when I was doing my own therapy and recovery, because I subsequently went on to burn out a number of times, I did have a counsellor say to me at one time, can you accept that you've been working on behalf of the state since you were 13 years of age, and it's time for you to step down? It's time for you to step away from being so close to trauma and complex trauma and people who still don't have a voice or whatever. So I think there's one side to it, which is like, for some birth children, look, I don't know, they've done their part, move on in your life. But then I think there's others, and if they are interested in fostering, and if they have done some work around it in terms of, like, say, for example, if I had started fostering while I had all that rage, I need to come to some understanding of how fostering had impacted me. But I think there are some birth children who could be incredible foster parents, because we grew up with it, we know it. And if we haven't been burnt out by it, we're very skilled around just what the landscape. We know the landscape. We might not have maps for the landscape, but we know a lot of the landscape intuitively. So yeah, I do think there are some people who have, as birth children, who could be interested and who could be very good.
What would you say to foster carers now, or people thinking about foster care, with regards to their birth children?
I tend to keep it short enough, but there are a couple of key things I say to them, because it does happen. One of the things I ask them about the ages of their own children, if they have children, And I say to them, so I can only share an experience as someone who was always older than all the foster children. We never had foster children who were older than us or even our own ages. So me, my birth sister and my birth brother, we always had the integrity of our family intact. It was always 1, 2, 3, if you understand me. We never fostered children who were of an age between me and my sister or between my sister and my brother. And there was something about how our family was kept intact in that way that worked really well. You know, now maybe it would have been fine if it had been different to that, but that's all I know as a birth child. I don't know what it's like to have foster siblings older than me. So I say to people, you know, think about whether or not you want to disrupt the integrity of the children you have already in terms of if you foster kids the same age or older than some of them. Just have to think about that. And the other thing I say to them is talk to people who are fostering currently about what it's really like, because other foster families will be your network of support. They'll be your go-to people. If you go this route, they'll be your natural community of support. So, you know, talk to them and check it out. And I also do say it will bring you, just like having any child in your life, it will bring you places you could never have dreamt of. Good, bad, or indifferent. You know, that can happen with any child. You know, the vulnerability of loving and parenting any child will take you places you couldn't imagine. So, yeah.
Very true.
Yeah.
And to birth children, what do you say to that?
I think birth children give each other a bit of a knowing look. Oh, it's like, oh. I always assumed it was different for them than it was, you know. I'm like, oh, so how is it for you? You know, because the experiences can be so vastly different. So, you know, we fostered 50 or 60 kids for all durations of time. I might meet a birth child and they only ever fostered 2 boys who were always older than her. Do you know what I mean? That's a vastly different fostering experience. My own siblings' experiences of fostering were different to mine because they were younger than me. And I think there were some things that were more frustrating for them than they were for me. So, while on the one level, there's a knowing kind of, you've been on this journey. There's also a kind of, well, what was it like for you? Because it can be so vastly different. And I do have a terror. Like, I think it's important to acknowledge birth children and where we are in the picture, but I do have a bit of a terror of every birth child suddenly having a therapist because they grew up in a family that fostered. Do you know what I mean? I would hate it to be, what's that word? Is it pathologized? Or I do have a bit of an inner terror around that.
How would you say it's shaped you? And again, we're not pathologizing it, but just looking at how has it contributed to your life as a person? How has it shaped you, if you can say?
Yeah, it informed me becoming an advocate, for sure, and being quite a passionate advocate. It also, as well, I have never read very much about to what extent middle-class children go into care. But I suppose I was quite aware that quite a few of the children who stayed with us, especially the older children, there was never much money. And some professions, like social workers, therapists, they can be from quite middle-class backgrounds. And I have found myself, as well as being an advocate, also having an eye out for, has a very middle-class solution. It's wonderful, but that's not going to work for somebody who does not have that extra 20 or 30 quid to throw at that. There's something that also came from, okay, my own background was working class, but it also came from being around a lot of children in care who do not have, often their network of resources, and their resources are exceptionally thin. They don't have family to fall back on sometimes if it was a very toxic family situation. Their supports in life are so thin. They don't get second chances. They don't get third chances. It's so thin. So I find myself still at times a bit agitated around solutions or way forward they don't work for people who don't, you know, some people's network of support and access to resources is very, very thin. And that is often the case for people who've been in care. their options are very different to other people's. The range of choices that they have, the number of second chances that they get are a lot less than what other people often get in life. So yeah, I think that's there as well from having grown up in fostering. And I'm really glad I have that. To have that antenna, because I've gone on I'm very middle class. I own my home and very comfortable. I have resources now, but I think it kept me there are people who really do not have what you have, and be alert to this. Yeah.
Yeah. As we're coming towards the end of our time, I want to really encourage people to read the book because, as I say, your voice is so strong. The teenager's voice is so strong in it. It's so honest. It's so direct. It's so clear, and it covers a lot of ground in a very descriptive way. We've only touched into it now, so really would encourage people to read the book. But is there anything, Fiona, that you would like to add yourself before we come to a close?
I don't think so, to be honest. I kind of think, people are sick of me. I realised the book had had great publicity when a friend of mine said, "Oh, so-and-so fosters, so I told her about your book." And she said, "Oh, for Christ's sake, if I hear another thing about that book, I'm sick hearing about it." And I was like, "Oh, that's great PR. The foster world is sick of it already."
It's working. Well, thank you very much for writing it. It's a very unique account, and it stays with you long after you finish the last page. So thank you so much for all the work you've done since, and for talking to us today. Thank you, Fiona.
Very kind. Thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure, Niamh. Thank you.
It was great to catch up with Fiona, and I can highly recommend her book, Parcels in the Post, Growing Up with 50 Siblings, which is published by New Island Books and which is available to buy at bookstores nationwide or online.